Alright, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Marvyn and I will be presenting to you the new business model today. Let me start off by asking you guys a few questions, and you may answer them by a show of hands. Who of you has ever worried about finding a job after graduation? Alright, now, who of you has ever worried about compensation and being treated fairly by your future employer?
Sure.
Alright, still a few of you. And lastly, who has ever worried about the long-term prospects of the American economy and the job market?
That would be me.
Alright, alright. So just about a week ago, a large portion of the approximately 50 million people that cast their vote for Donald Trump did so because they felt like the economy wasn't working for them. And to some degree, that same sentiment fueled the popularity of Democratic candidate Bernie Sanders. It is a story of people seeing very little of the economic benefits promised by globalization, as they are mainly captured by large corporations and their executives, as they are enabled by an established group of lobbyists and politicians in Washington. The trend line is obvious, and we shall name it growing income inequality. Which basically means that the rich are getting richer while the poor are getting poorer. More specifically though, it means that a larger share of the population collects less and less of the total income, while a few at the top collect ever more. The majority struggles to afford the lifestyle they once had and feel pessimistic about the future and about their children's futures. And while this is obviously problematic for that group specifically, it is also problematic for the economy as a whole. Income inequality, has a direct negative effect on economic growth within a developed economy, which means that as inequality rises, economic growth is slowed. And this is bad news for all of you out there who are looking for jobs. On an emotional level, let's get back to the people that voted for Donald Trump. Their vote is a sign of fading trust in the current system. This applies to politics, but also to business, which I would like to talk to you about today. Trust has enabled humans to collaborate and to become civilized, and it continues to be the foundation of our society today. It also enables business transactions, and likewise our modern globalized economy as we know it. In my presentation today, I will showcase a continuum of business models while pointing out how they may have gotten us to where we find ourselves today, before ultimately making a few suggestions as to what a business model of the future may look like and how it may recreate some trust through a sense of fairness. So let me start off by explaining the business model that the majority of corporations use today. A person, or multiple persons, let's call them John and Glenn, have some cash that they're looking to invest. They find a business venture with promising potential to produce returns on their investment. Let's imagine this business venture is a hamburger restaurant, and we'll call it Bob's Burgers. The cash enables the business venture to get started. In our example, it pays for renting a building, stacking the kitchen with supplies, and hiring cooks and cashiers. With the promise of a delicious hamburger for a reasonable price, customers will hopefully be attracted and willing to buy hamburgers, generating revenues for Bob's Burgers. And if those revenues are greater than the cost of rent, supplies, staff, etc., Bob's Burgers has achieved its purpose of generating a return on John and Glenn's investment. In the process of doing so, however, other persons have also profited economically. Take the cooks and cashiers, for example, who have jobs that generates them some income. And remember, jobs is what you guys are after too. The same goes for the supplier, who's paid for supplying meats, bread, and ketchup, and even the customer is happy, because he can enjoy a delicious hamburger at a reasonable price. Notice, however, that without the initial investment of John and Glenn, the process would have never gotten started. And all the stakeholders, including the employee, are left without the benefits. This is precisely the reasoning behind maximizing shareholder value, which is the first along our continuum of business models today. Maximizing shareholder value, or MSV, in our example is to generate the greatest returns possible for the cash of John and Glenn. This should be the sole purpose of Bob's Burgers, due to the essential component of the business venture being the cash that enabled it. While the prioritization may sound logical, its simplicity does not come without consequence. The variables and costs I touched on a minute ago, including you, the employee, are judged only by their contribution to the generation of profits. In other words, Bob's Burgers will hire employees to serve rising customer demand, but also fire them as demand declines. In this way, employees are just another form of assets that are paid at a legally set minimum level or at market price, much like meat, bread, and ketchup. All of these variables can be twisted and turned, increased or decreased, to achieve the purpose of Bob's Burgers, which is to generate more cash for John and Glenn. The only restriction is the necessity to comply with the law. Let's summarize the benefits of this model. Assuming the business venture is successful, John and Glenn's initial investment is the cause of many resulting cash flows. One of them being to you, the employee, enabling you to go out and make purchases and investments of your own in the surrounding economy, spurring growth even further. And another important one is the cash flow back to John and Glenn themselves, as it allows them to reinvest their earnings in other business ventures, starting the process all over again. On the political side, these benefits may lead politicians to support policies and laws that facilitate MSV further, such as lowering taxes on income from investments, as the one in our example, so John and Glenn can reinvest their capital more easily. That makes sense, right? So let's check and see what some of the outcomes were of MSV since it's been implemented in the 1980s by multinational corporations such as General Electric. We see in 1979, or since 1979, incomes of the top 1%, in our example represented by John and Glenn, have rose by an average of 200%, while those of the bottom 80, which is likely where most of us will end up in the future, only rose by approximately 42%. That means that John and Glenn have outpaced us in terms of income by a factor of 5. Talk about inequality. I'd like to add globalization into the picture and explain how it contributes to income inequality and the resulting decrease in trust in business and the economy in general. Globalization, as you may have heard before, describes an ever-increasing interconnectedness between different parts of the world and an increased flow of information, money, goods, and people between them. For Bob's Burgers, as for any business venture these days, the implications are huge. Meat, bread, and ketchup can now be imported from a different country where they're cheaper to purchase and perhaps available at the same conditions year-round. Consumers will again be happy about the lower price of hamburgers thanks to cheaper inputs. On the flip side, Bob's Burgers may seize an opportunity to export its name and secret formula and open up stores abroad. If the conditions are right, any profits that Bob's Burgers restaurants generate abroad may even be brought back into the US, where John and Glenn are waiting with open arms and open pockets, for that matter. Sounds like another win-win, right? At least for investors and for the consumers of hamburgers, which, let's be honest, that's a lot of us. Combined, those two groups can exert a great amount of influence on politics, which they did in this case, and politicians all around the world responded by negotiating trade agreements that allowed for more favorable conditions for the flow of information, money, goods, and people. The US, for example, signed NAFTA with Mexico and Canada, and it came into effect in 1994. If we have a look back at our income graph from earlier, however, we can see a significant spike in the growth of income of the top 1%, starting at about 1994, while other incomes remained relatively flat. And although the bottom 80% were able to afford more hamburgers since their price went down, the greatest benefactors were again the Johns and Glenns of the world. I would also like to talk about you again and the jobs you're looking for after graduation. Notice that the pursuit of Bob's Burgers to lower their cost does not stop with importing cheap ketchup. If it is cost effective, they may attempt to replace their cashiers with automated kiosks and only retain a handful of technical support personnel in case those kiosks do not function properly. In other words, MSV evaluates labor mainly for its profitability, just like ketchup. Finally, I would like to highlight another implication of globalization that has to do with the interconnectedness between countries, but also the rise of technology. As multinational corporations have sought to find cheap resources all over the world and to move their manufacturing to countries with low labor costs, it is important to remember the two guiding principles of MSV, which are profitability and compliance with the law. The latter, of course, refers to the laws of whichever country a multinational corporation operates in or sources from. In an extreme example, it would be fine for Bob's Burgers to open their own ketchup operation in a country with favorable labor laws, which would allow workers to work 14 hours a day with only 2 10-minute breaks for 6 days a week in exchange for a paycheck of only $10. This example, while by no means being unrealistic, can have serious implications for Bob's Burgers consumers who may not want to enjoy their delicious hamburger at the cost of another person being treated so unfairly, even if this person is halfway around the globe. And this is because it may not seem like they are so far away, with globalization and the internet allowing for stories and images to travel the world effortlessly. So more examples of unethical conduct of multinational corporations under the name of MSV include environmental pollution, human rights violations, and more subpar working environments. A more conscious public that has become aware of these issues triggered a shift in business thinking, which gave rise to the second business model along our continuum, which you know as corporate social responsibility, or CSR. The basic fabric of it is not much different than MSV. Glenn and John still invest money and are looking for a return, and they remain within the boundaries of the law. Bob's Burgers will continue to buy meat, bread, and ketchup, and the jobs will also still be there. However, CSR adds an ethical component to business considerations. Going back to our ketchup example, Bob's Burgers may now attempt to be more fair with their ketchup producers and pay them more money while improving the working conditions in the factories. Also, they may purchase organic tomatoes that were responsibly grown and harvested. To legitimize their intentions, and more importantly to show their customers, Bob's Burgers will seek approval of an independent ketchup production process controlling group so they can officially label their ketchup as responsibly produced. Other CSR measures include the world-famous fair trade coffee, reducing carbon emissions, and creating economic opportunity for those less fortunate. CSR does come at a cost, however, as many of us notice every day as we purchase Starbucks products at a premium price, because we are aware of and taste the difference between fair trade coffee beans and generic ones. Furthermore, just because a company advertises some of its responsible business practices, it does not automatically ensure that all of their business practices are just as responsible and ethical. Take British Petrol, known as BP, for example. Their values, according to their website, are safety, respect, and excellence, which guide the responsible actions necessary for their work they do every day. This seems to suggest that they take CSR seriously, right? Well, take that with a grain of salt and think back to 2010 when they were responsible for this, Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico. The BP example falls into one of the most prevalent criticisms of CSR, which is that companies use it as a smokescreen to distract from other bad business practices, which does not help with the trust issue business is facing at all. To summarize CSR, the basic structure is the same as for MSV. The same hamburger restaurant as we've come to know it, only with more responsibly produced products, which come at a slightly higher price. The price difference can almost entirely be attributed to increased cost for supplies, which result in similar cash flows for everyone else, including staff and investors. In other words, CSR has not led to wage gains for U.S. workers, and instead continued to fuel income growth for the top 1%. Inequality and trust continue to be a problem. In an ideal scenario, businesses, employees, and governments should find themselves in the same boat sailing towards a common goal, which is prosperity. Business and employees should be striving to create win-win outcomes, with the government providing a regulatory framework for the economy that allows for those win-win situations to occur. It is in this way that the globalized and interconnected economies of the world in general would flourish, serving each other's ever more complex demands and raising the living standards of billions around the world. The current business models of maximizing shareholder value and CSR are not likely to bring us any closer to the described ideal scenario. Quite the opposite. As I've described before, they have contributed to rising inequality and undermined trust through outsourcing jobs and unethical business practices, triggering a political climate that enabled Donald Trump to win the presidency, as he campaigned with anti-trade and anti-globalization rhetoric, both of which, in my humble opinion, will most likely lead to lose-lose outcomes. So in order to set the sail in the right direction, we need a business model that will reunite businesses, employees, and governments by reinstating trust and achieving a fair distribution of the profits generated by business. So the new business model relies on the same basics as any business model, which is the need to be profitable and to comply with the law. It furthermore demands being socially responsible, as this is arguably becoming more of a license to operate than a diversification strategy. Businesses who will act irresponsibly will not fare well with an increasingly conscious customer base. Now, let me tell you what's new about the model. The business model will have 4 guiding principles that aim to reunite businesses and their employees, which will consequently lead to policies that favor each side rather than taking away from both of them. The 4 principles are transparency, fairness, as well as flexibility and a long-term orientation. Transparency and fairness have the general purpose of creating trust between businesses and their employees, and other stakeholders too, for that matter. As an example, I would like to use global auto parts supplier Magna, who employs more than 150,000 people in 310 branches worldwide. Although the diversity in terms of what they do and who they employ could not be greater, they are bound together by a corporate constitution that is embraced all the way from their CEO to Magna factory workers on the other side of the world. At the heart of this constitution is a profit-sharing formula, which you see here, that predetermines how much each stakeholder group will receive on an annual basis. It reads as follows. Shareholders will get 20% of after-tax profits in the form of dividends. Employees will get 10% of pre-tax profits either in the form of shares in the company, which lets them earn further as they take part in the shareholder compensation, or in the form of cash. Management will get up to 6% of pre-tax profits. A minimum of 7% will be dedicated to research and development to ensure future success and competitiveness of Magna, and 2% will be used for social responsibility to invest in the community Magna is located in, or to help with disaster relief, for example. Finally, the last 55% will be paid in taxes and used for reinvestments in the company. The profit-sharing formula is obviously transparent to everyone in the company, as it is omnipresent, hanging up on every office and factory wall. Employees know that hard work will be rewarded at the end of a successful year, which unites them and motivates them. They can trust in this promise that has remained untouched ever since it was formally adopted by Magna in 1984. Furthermore, it is fair in terms of everyone getting the chance to participate in the company's profitability and growth, giving even regular workers a chance to build wealth through the accumulation of shares of company stock. This relates back to the second question I asked you guys in the beginning. Wouldn't you want to be treated this way as an employee? And wouldn't it motivate you to be at your best every year? The second set of principles are long-term orientation, are flexibility and long-term orientation. Flexibility is needed to cope with the implications of interconnectedness and interdependence caused by globalization. Bob's Burgers can once again serve as an example. On its supply side, meats, bread, and ketchup, especially when sourced from all around the world, are subject to fluctuating prices and availability. Also on the demand side, seasonality, customers not willing to spend money on hamburgers for various reasons, or the introduction of popular substitute can add to fluctuating demand. To deal with these uncertainties, otherwise rigid agreements can be structured in a flexible way. For example, instead of paying a flat rental fee for Bob's Burgers buildings, they could negotiate a rental agreement that will adjust the charge according to its profits. In other words, rent may be 5% lower in case Bob's Burgers is experiencing a less than average month, and 5% higher in case profits are above average for the month. Another aspect that could be negotiated in a more flexible manner is labor contracts. This time, a fixed wage would be agreed upon based on the average of 40 hours a week. In busy times, however, Bob's Burgers may ask its cooks and cashiers, which is you, remember, to work more than 40 hours to cover the demand so they don't have to add extra personnel. Likewise, in slow weeks, cooks and cashiers may only be required to work 35 hours, which would allow the restaurant to retain their workers despite slow business. They would retain some of the extra profits from its busy weeks in order to equal out the higher labor costs from slow weeks. For you as an employee, this would mean greater job and income security. Notice, too, that this applies to any business, as they all have agreements and contracts that can be structured in a more flexible way. A long-term orientation is simply the result of the three other principles. Transparency and fairness build trust that will be the foundation of lasting relationships between shareholders and employees, between John and Glenn, the investors, and you, the employee. At the same time, they may reduce some of the income inequality we have seen rise so sharply in this country, lifting everyone's living standards, not just those of the top 1%. And flexibility will allow these relationships to last and overcome the changes and turbulence of the interconnected global markets. Finally, solving the trust and equality issues and reuniting business and employees may enable government to implement some policies that reward business for taking a first step and implementing measures such as a corporate constitution, led by the example of Magna. In summary, I hope that the new business model will be able to address some of everyone's worries about finding a job after college, about the compensation and fairness you can expect from your employer, and about the long-term prospects of the economy. I hope it may reunite business and the public, so that future elections may be one with rhetoric about how society as a whole can benefit from a growing economy that works on fair and transparent terms. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.
Nice one.
Good job, Mark.
Well delivered.